Septuagint and its early history. Simply stated, the Septuagint is a translation of the Hebrew Bible from the Greek language. Now, the interesting thing about that is we do not have not even a single copy or even a scrap of a single copy of the text, the Hebrew text from which the Septuagint was translated. We don't have any of it at all. So nobody knows what the Hebrew text looked like before the translators started to translate it. And the translation was done in two phases. The first phase was the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. And that was done roughly about 270 to 280 BC. We don't have the exact year, but we approximate it. 270, 280 BC. And the rest of it was translated afterwards, before the year 100 BCE. Before the year 100 BCE. And so that was the two phases, first the Pentateuch. And there's a letter that was written, which, when it's analyzed carefully, they realized the letter was a fabrication. But from the data in the letter, it's still clear anyway that the first phase of it was translated around 270 to 280 BCE. So that value of the letter was good, even if the rest of it was a fabrication. And you could read that in the bibliography. Now, there are many people who want to base what they believe on the Septuagint. I've come across some of them, and I've had arguments with them. Now, there are a variety of reasons why people today have an interest in the Septuagint. And I want to state the two most important reasons why they have an interest in it. I'm talking about even scholars. The New Testament theological vocabulary is often taken from the vocabulary of the Septuagint. So that the Septuagint is a bridge between the Hebrew words of the Hebrew Bible and the Greek words of the New Testament. And that has a value. And there are some modern lexicons which, when you look up the Hebrew, it will tell you what the equivalent word is in the Septuagint and also in the New Testament. In other words, the New Testament writers often look to the Septuagint to know what Greek word to use for certain theological terms that were the equivalent of the Old Testament. And so this is one value of the Septuagint. It gives a bridge between the Hebrew words and the Greek words. And a second reason is that the first few centuries of Christianity, for the first few centuries, the version of the Old Testament that was used by Christians was the Septuagint rather than the Hebrew Bible. Now, why would that be? It's because of language limitations. And it's a very interesting aspect that in order to understand the history of the Septuagint, and the history of the Septuagint includes what happened with it, what happened to it, where it was used. In order to know where it was used, you have to know why it was used. And for that, it's necessary to discuss ancient languages. In other words, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but every now and then it will be important to mention a little bit about the history of the Hebrew language, the history of the Aramaic language, the history of the Greek language, and where they were used. Because if you don't, then you don't understand why the Septuagint needed to be used in certain places. I want to mention next this translation. It's the New English translation of the Septuagint. Now, the first translation that was made was completed in 1844 and published for the first time in 1851. And that's known as the Brenton translation. And the Brenton translation was based upon one complete Greek text of the Septuagint. One complete Greek text that was actually written, hand copied approximately the year 350 AD. 350 AD. And that's what? About 600 years after the Pentateuch was first translated. 600 years later. And so that you had just one text from which Brenton's translation was translated. And scholars have recognized that they need to have a better text than just going to that one text and translating from that one text dating from 350 AD, the Brenton translation. And that's where this translation comes in, a New English translation of the New Testament. Scholars spent decades going through 600 handwritten copies that have survived of parts of the Septuagint. 600 handwritten copies. And they produced over 20 volumes of the Greek text. And they're available at major libraries. I've seen it, and I've photocopied some pages from them, the specific interest that I had. And what happens is, when you look at it, the top one-fifth of each of those pages is what's called the critical text, that the scholars have decided is probably better than the rest of the handwritten copies. And they don't come from just one handwritten copy, the top one-fifth. It's interesting to know the process that they use, which I'm going to describe. The other 80% of the page is variations found among the other 600 copies. In other words, there's footnotes at each phrase or each word of the top one-fifth. They have those footnotes repeated in the other 80% of the page, and they show variants found in other handwritten texts of the Septuagint. So you could see that with 80% showing variations of all those texts in the footnotes, compared to the top 20%, there's a lot of differences between the different texts of the Septuagint. Now, I would like to describe loosely how the modern scholars have arrived at the critical text, the top 20% of the page. Well, first of all, there are very, very few fragments of any of the handwritten copies of the Septuagint from before the time of Origen. Origen is the most prolific Christian scholar. He wrote Jewish translations. He took texts of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, and not only the Septuagint, but he also looked at other translations that Jews had made.
2nd century.
The Jews had made in about the year 135, Aquila translated the Bible from the Hebrew into the Greek. Aquila about the year 135. And then Symmachus about the year 180 AD. He translated a second translation from the Hebrew into the Greek. And Theodotion was a third one, about the year 200 AD, who translated the Bible from the Hebrew into the Greek. And so we have these three, Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion. And these three are what Origen included in his work, which is estimated to have had 50 volumes in 6 columns. And it's called the Hexapla. It's called the Hexapla. And 3 of those 6 columns were these 3 translations from the Hebrew into the Greek. Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion. Those 3. And the scholars call those 3 the 3. That's what they call it, the 3. Because they were the 3 that Origen put into the Hexapla in order to compare with the 5th column. And the 5th column was Origen's version of the Septuagint. Now, why did he have a fifth column of the Septuagint? The answer is because he knew that the Christians were using the Septuagint for their Bible. The Christians were using the Septuagint for their Bible. And he knew that they considered it to be inspired. And whether he really considered it to be inspired, he was very quiet about, because he didn't want to upset the apple cart of the Christians. And so he never said it was not inspired. But he gave enough indication that a careful reader could see, based upon some of his letters, that he had doubts of this inspiration of the Septuagint. Because one of the things that he wrote is that sometimes he had great difficulty deciding what the fifth column should have, what the Septuagint should have in the hexapla. And when he couldn't make up his mind among the various versions he saw, he went to Achilles' literal translation. And he used that and compared it with Symmachus and Theodotion in order to decide what to put in for the Septuagint. And he called it healing the Septuagint. He used the Greek word that means healing. He healed the Septuagint by looking at the three, by looking at Aquila primarily, and then Symmachus and Theodotion, in order to heal the Septuagint. And he didn't do it everywhere. He only did it where he had question deciding which of the versions of the Septuagint to use. He wrote that there were three major recensions, and each recension represented a whole group of texts of the Septuagint. There was one group of text, another whole group of text, and another whole group of text. Three recensions. And he never explained why he thought one recension was any better than the others. He was silent about that. But he had many handwritten texts. He had difficulty deciding which was closer to the original, and he used the three to heal the Septuagint in his fifth column. And so what scholars have decided to do, to arrive at the critical text, the top 1/5 of the page of the critical Greek text, over 20 volumes, is they have gathered all of the commentaries that Origen wrote on the Old Testament. And they looked for every single quote they could find from the Septuagint. And so they've gathered all these texts of Origen from his commentaries on the Septuagint. And then they compared it with all of the 600 handwritten copies that were mostly after he died. In other words, what happened was, when Origen died in the year 253 or 4, we don't know which, 253 or 4, it was the latest reasonably complete books of the Septuagint, handwritten, were from 50 years later or further, or later than that. And so they compared those texts with Origen's quotations from the Septuagint, and that's how they decided which ones were best. Because they had no choice but to figure, well, he studied it more than anybody else. We don't have surviving copies earlier much, and so they used Origen as their guide. They used Origen as their guide to pick up the most reliable text, what they thought would be. And that's how they arrived at the critical Greek text from which a New English translation of the Septuagint was made. And this, incidentally, was published in the year 2007. It was over 60 years in the making, getting through all of these volumes and volumes of handwritten copies of Greek texts and comparing with Origen. It was a very long project. I want to go on to the next chapter I have here is the Septuagint, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and contradictions with the Masoretic text. That's this next chapter. The Hebrew text from which the Septuagint was translated is called the Vorlage, which no longer exists. We don't know what the Hebrew text looked like from before it was translated. It is certainly possible that certain statements in the Septuagint Pentateuch were never in the Forlage, the original Hebrew from which it was translated. We just don't know. And then possible reasons could be deliberate bias distortions by the translators. And that's what I want to discuss about now here. Emmanuel Tove, he wrote quite a bit on the Septuagint. Whole volumes have been put together of his writings that had to do with the Septuagint. And he discusses different types of biblical texts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. He also was a scholar looking through the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he says that among the 220 texts of the Bible in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's only 3 parts of 3 books of the Old Testament that have a resemblance to the Septuagint. Only 3 parts of 3 of the 220. And he says that it's not enough to even call it a text type. It's not enough of a grouping to give it credence of its use anciently. And he is also one of the authors who wrote in favor of the Masoretic text. And he actually stated that even in the Talmud, that's a whole other topic, I'm not going to discuss the Talmud, but it was started to be written about the year 200 AD. And in the Talmud, there are many quotations from the Hebrew Pentateuch. And they're identical to the Masoretic text, with the ancient verb endings, not like the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so he says that scholars have recognized that the Masoretic text, even though we don't have a full ancient copy of it from way back, the fact that they're quoting word for word exactly as the Masoretic text in the Talmud shows that they recognize it was authoritative. And there are statements in the Talmud that denigrate, that speak against the Septuagint, because they recognize things against it. The Jews did not, they gave it up. Now, one of the problems, why did the Jews give up the use of the Septuagint, even though they were, in fact, the original translators? It's because copyists were so sloppy. They were so sloppy, and that's what they didn't like about it. And they said, we can't use the sloppiness. And they didn't want to use it. But up to a certain point in time, they did use it. And we don't have an exact knowledge of the year when they stopped using it. But a good hint is the fact that Aquila's translation, Symmachus' translation, and Theodosian's translation were needed. They were needed. They were in Greek, from Hebrew to Greek, but they were needed because the sloppiness of the Septuagint copies. One of the scholars that I quote from that I like is Vanderwood. He said another problem was how to account for the variations between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. Some scholars attributed the differences simply to the license of the Hebrew translators. That license means, in other words, that they took license with the text. They were not faithful to the Hebrew. Others thought that the translators worked from an early version of the Hebrew text that differed from the Hebrew of the Masoretic text. That they think it's part of their mind going in a different direction from the exact copy, letter for letter, the way the Masoretic endings of the grammar and verbs were. Without knowing this was so, or whether the Greek text was simply a very fine translation, free translation, a very free translation, it was difficult to use the Septuagint for text historical or text critical purposes. In other words, scholars cannot have confidence that when you look at the Septuagint, it can really be used with any confidence. That's what they're saying.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Who are the scholars that they are discrediting Septuagint, and who are the scholars that they are saying Hebrew text is authentic? Just examples, like names.
Well, I have a bibliography with over 40 references. And when you download that, you'll be able to see the references and see some of that yourself.
Okay.
Okay.
I mean, it's a bit.
Yes, you're asking for specific scholars. There have been many people have gotten doctoral dissertations by writing on the Septuagint and by writing on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And those scholars, based upon, I want to say, I've looked at many papers that were published that have to do with biblical research, and a lot of them make no sense to me because they're not in harmony with the scriptures. And my opinion is that at least 90% of the scholars are agnostics. I don't really believe that they believe that they have a firm faith in the scriptures, and they're founding in that way. And most of those scholars are people who have faith in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are some scholars that don't have faith in Dead Sea Scrolls, even though they've spent a lot of time studying it. Emmanuel Tove is one of them. I quote from him in this paper, if you get a full download of the seminar.
Is Tove Orthodox?
No, Tove is not an Orthodox Jew. As a matter of fact, the fellow that I met face to face spoke with Emmanuel Tove in Israel, and he told me that Emmanuel Tove does not exhibit a very firm belief even in Judaism, but he grew up as a Jew, and he got his degree from Hebrew. Well, I'm not sure exactly what degree where he got it. I think he might have gotten it from Harvard University, and then did postgraduate studies in Hebrew University. But nevertheless, the friend of mine that I spoke with face to face is skeptical that Emmanuel Tove really does have a firm faith. Now, I want to mention one important aspect. When you look at in Genesis, there are 2 chapters that discuss chronology. They mention at a certain year, a certain person was born, and it was a year of a certain person's age. And it goes through a whole list of people and at what age they were when a certain person was born. And it leads to an ability to calculate exactly how many years it was from the time of the creation of Adam up until the flood. And in the Masoretic text, that total number of years is significantly less than it is in Egyptian chronology. In Egyptian chronology, it's about 600 or 700 years more. In other words, it's older. They want to make the Egyptian civilization older than what it is in the Masoretic text. And the differences come up in the following way. There's a certain priest of the Egyptians named Manetho, and he is responsible for writing down a chronology. And it's caused people to wonder a whole lot about Egyptian chronology when they try to compare it with the scripture. And I have a reference where you could look up about Manetho and so forth. But the point is simply this. The Jews that were living in Egypt, that were involved in the translation, what they did is, for certain people, they added 100 years to about a half a dozen people's age when a son was born that's given in the genealogy. In other words, the Jews that were the translators, apparently, and I say apparently because we do not have the Septuagint that goes back to when it was first done. But nevertheless, what we have is Jews adding 100 years to several different people in the chronology in order to make Adam go back further in history than the Egyptian chronology. And it's a strange thing that there are people who have studied Sumerian chronology anciently that even have a story of the flood and certain rules before that and whatever. And they say that the Sumerian chronology agrees with the Masoretic text. Unlike the Septuagint, which goes back about 700 years earlier. And so scholars have absolutely no confidence in the chronology that's given in Genesis in the Septuagint translation.
Herb, could you clarify that? You're saying that the,
Yeah, okay, I'll repeat your question and I'll respond.
I'll
Christina.
probably forget it though, I'm so senile. They were trying to reconcile the ancient Egyptian Manetho by adding these 100 years.
Yes. The claim is that the translators of the Septuagint took these various people in the genealogy and the age at which a certain son was born that was named in Scripture, they added 100 years to a whole group of people in order to have the chronology of the Septuagint come back earlier than the Egyptian chronology as given by Manetho. That's what scholars believe is why they did it. And if they were so sloppy that they were adding 100 years to this, 100 years to that, 100 years to the other, in order to make it older than Egyptian chronology, then it shows that they were sloppy with the translation. There was sloppiness going on. And then another major area is on the Feast of Weeks. The Feast of Weeks. Now, people know that if you look carefully at the Hebrew text, which I don't have any time to go into all that, Pentecost should be on Sunday. It should be on a Sunday. But, and the Hebrew text does point that out. The Masoretic text points out it should be on a Sunday. But the Septuagint does not have it that way. The Septuagint does not have Pentecost coming out on a Sunday because they want to start the count with the day after the first day of unleavened bread. That's the way the Masoretic text has it.
Pharisaic reckoning.
That's the Pharisaic way of doing it. The priesthood disagreed with that. The priesthood followed the Masoretic text. And the Pharisees didn't. And for historical reasons that we don't have a record of, the Septuagint followed the method of the Pharisees, which is the way the modern Jews do it. The way the modern Jews do it. They follow the Pharisees. And the Talmud, which was through the progeny of the Pharisees, followed the Pharisaical method. And even though the plain statement in the Masoretic text indicates it should be on a Sunday, modern Jews don't do that. They follow the Pharisees. Enough said on that. I want to quote from another scholar who has written a lot of good things in terms of how he analyzes the Septuagint. He says the translators of the Septuagint tend to render Hebrew words and sometimes Hebrew roots by a single Greek equivalent. Since words in different languages rarely have the same exact meaning, this lexical stereotyping leads to contextual uses that are unnatural in Greek. More often than not, the equivalent is adequate enough in some contexts, but does not fit certain other contexts. It also happens, however, that the Greek equivalent from the start diverged in meaning from the Hebrew, unquote. Now, another quote from him is, at times it appears that the translators confused different Hebrew words or forms. In summary, inadequacies in scholarly knowledge concerning biblical Hebrew among the translators of the Septuagint should typically cause the modern reader to lack full confidence in blindly accepting the Septuagint's apparent equivalent of a rare Hebrew word as correct. Now, one thing that you also get from that quote, a very interesting thing from that quote is this. The most voluminous book on ancient Greek is the Liddell and Scott lexicon. It's about 1,200, 1,300 pages, I have that. And if you look up a Greek word that's used in the New Testament in Liddell and Scott, you may have a flavor that's not intended by the Hebrew equivalent. And that's for the very reason that the scholar indicated. You see, the people that wrote the Septuagint, that decided to pick a certain Greek word as the equivalent of a certain Hebrew word used in the Masoretic text or the Hebrew Bible, the problem is that if they picked an incorrect Greek word to start out with, it kept being used anyway, even into the New Testament. So you cannot always depend upon Liddell and Scott to know the meaning intended in the New Testament for a Greek word. Instead, you have to go back to the Septuagint and see how they used it for the Hebrew word, and by doing the bridge from the Hebrew to the Greek, you could find out what was intended by that word. So it requires caution in using Liddell and Scott as a lexicon guide for the New Testament Greek.
Folks, these seminars are set up to be 45 minutes apiece, and Herb knew coming in that he would not be able to cover them in just 45 minutes for the topic, so he's got a two-parter, okay? So at this point, what we might be a good thing to do is just everybody stand up, stretch for about 5 minutes maybe, and then we'll resume and pick up right where you had here. Take a quick bathroom break, get their stacks of drinks out here, get you a stack of drink and whatever, and then we'll come back. How are we on are you about halfway through?
Well, I'm going to pace it. That's
You're
all
on the
right.
pace.
Yeah.
Okay. Appreciate you doing that.
Okay.
What's your favorite lexicon?
My favorite lexicon? It's the Bauer, Art, Gingrich, Danker lexicon. From
Bauer,
Art,
Art,
A-R-N-D-T.
A-R-N.
Called BDAG.
It's called BDAG. However, Danker, in about the year 2007, wrote a concise lexicon of the New Testament in Greek. And so that lexicon, the BDAG lexicon with Danker in the year 2000, that's about 1,000 pages. And it's a good one, but it's unabridged. And I'm going to suggest that you get the shorter, the concise version that Danker wrote about the year 2007,
Okay.
which is a one-volume summary.
cheaper, too.
And it's a lot cheaper, yes.
Yeah. Good to see you, Herb.
Yeah, Todd Durst. I remember you.
You got a great memory. Good to see you.
I just found out in August that I'm half Ashkenazi Jew.
Oh, okay.
I grew up in '69, and I thought my dad was my dad, and I found out there are 2 DNA tests. He's not.
Oh.
I'm not a Pike. I'm a Goldman Bronski.
Oh.
Do you know any Goldmans?
Well, when I lived in New York City, I think I
Yeah.
ran into a few.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Most of them moved up to Glace Bay, Nova Scotia, where
Oh.
my mom grew up.
Oh.
Big Britain Island, Nova Scotia.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I'm still working on trying to find out who my dad is. So, what a funny thing to find out at 69 years old.
I just couldn't. I didn't want to raise my hand and interrupt you, but when you were talking about the 100 years adding all that, I was wanting to say, did they use Dominion software? No, I didn't.
They must have.
But that's all I kept thinking. I don't know.
Stretch?
I'm already standing up, so I'm doing okay.
You need to address the time of Goshen. There's no Goshen back in the time of Joseph.
Well, the Goshen and Ramses are considered 2 names for the same area by Jews.
No question, but it's inserted there in Genesis 47 and the second included. Second one's in Exodus 111. Those are anachronistic geography.
Well, when people try to make maps and they put 2 dots close to one another and labeling one as Goshen and one as Ramses, that's a scholarly guess, and you can't trust the maps. In other words, I believe that they're just 2 different terms for the same area.
But Septuagint tells you who Goshen was. It's got a positive note right over it. It's, I believe it was put in there by Ezra. Because Geshem the Arabian was mentioned by Herodotus in Septuagint, Genesis 47:11. He's explaining, Ezra's explaining where that territory was where the first Exodus occurred from, and he's explaining to the second Exodus people who came with him back to Palestine, Judea. So, Geshem the Arabian shows up in Genesis, Joshua 10:16 and 11:41. Joshua fought against all the land of Goshen, and that would have been anachronistic in the 15th century. But if you know archaeologically what happened to Goshen under Amenhotep II, it was destroyed. They couldn't even use this city. It was twice as big as Hudson, and it was probably destroyed by Joshua. This is evidence Amenhotep II took Hebrew Shastra captives in the battle that was west of Chinnereth, which is, in other words, Amenhotep's last campaign was west of Sea of Galilee, and there would have been a lot of
Well, what
Israelites
you're
in that
talking
area.
about is far beyond.
Right. I know you can't go into that.
I just had a couple quick questions.
Yes.
When you were saying that the Septuagint basically is endorsing Savon 6, I guess, as far as from the Jewish point of view, as far as Pentecost, are you saying that the Leviticus 23 is worded that way differently, or something else shows that?
Well, first of all, when the Jews discuss the calendar, they don't. The modern Jews say 7/6 based upon the modern Jewish calendar. However, when you go back to the more ancient calendar, it was either 5, 6, or 7. 7, 5, 6, or 7. And the reason why it was is simply the fact that they didn't know if the first and second months had 29 days both, or 30 days both, or 129 and 130.
So it's a flexible
And-
empirical
in
calendar,
other words,
right?
in other words, the ancient calendar is based upon the sighting of the new moon.
Right.
And since they didn't know if the first and second months how many days those months would contain, they weren't sure when Pentecost would be, whether it would be
Because
the
they
fifth
thought
or
it went after the holy day and not after the Sabbath, right?
No, it had to do with the calendar.
It had to do with counting 50 days.
Yeah.
Pentecost is always 50 days after
Exactly, but
the
if you
first
start
day.
from Saturday, it's always going to be on the Sunday. But if you start from the holy days, it's going to be on July 6th, isn't that?
No, it's going to be on the 7, 5, 6, or 7.
Well, I mean,
Right.
I'm just saying it's not on Sunday; it's on a date.
It's on a date, yes.
Because your 14th or 15th is always a date.
Yes.
That if you start your count from a date, you're going to end up on a date.
Right.
But if you start it from Saturday, you're going to always end up on a Sunday or Monday, whatever it was. But it's going to be on a
But you're
day,
not gonna have,
not a date.
But with an empirical calendar, you're not going to have a fixed date inside of it. That's what he's saying.
Right, I understand it. I'm just wondering if.
Okay, we're clear.
Yeah,
We're clear.
yeah.
Okay.
I just wonder if the translation in Leviticus 23 says anything other than on the morrow after the Sabbath in the Septuagint. That's what I was asking.
Yes, it does.
So what does it say?
Well, you're welcome to look at it.
Okay, well,
Leviticus 23. I don't want to get too bogged down into those details.
Well, I was just curious how they were viewing it.
It says on the morrow after the first day. And the first day is the first day of unleavened bread. So it says on the morrow.
That's what it
after-
says?
Yes.
The morrow after first.
Right.
Well, that's how they get it. It's not Sabbath, they're saying it's first day.
Could you also address
Yeah, I'll just look at the details. We're talking about Masoretic, but do you know the Targum?
Yeah, that's Aramaic Targums. It's translation from the Aramaic into the Greek. Or from the Hebrew into the Aramaic. I'm saying it wrong. It's from the Hebrew into the Aramaic, and we do have some Aramaic Targums that survive. However, they are not back into the first century. What survives is from later centuries. And there's two different versions of the Targums.
I should be listening. I'm sorry. Forgive me for that.
That's all.
I have a question of some sources tell me that the Greek Septuagint was translated from the Aramaic Targum, and I was wondering.
No. That's ridiculous. No.
Okay.
Because first of all, we don't even have any record that there were Aramaic Targums at the time that the Septuagint was translated. And if they don't, there's no indication that they even existed. And if they didn't exist, they couldn't have been translated.
I think you need to address Jeremiah 8:8, the lying pen of the scribe, and Masoretic's being one with us. I clearly believe this Masoretic text is far superior and to anything else we have. But you need to address Exodus 12:40, where both the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls agree against the Masoretic that they didn't spend those 430 years down here.
I understand what you're saying. However, when the scholars read through that scripture, they imply that the context indicates that it's referring to the time from Abraham rather than only.
Because of the class structure there, doesn't need to apply to all the oppression.
They indicate that there's reason to believe that the text implies that it's from the time of Abraham onwards, rather than
just like Galatians 3:17.
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. Well, I don't want to.
Are you ready to get started again?
Whenever.
I had one other question if
Yes.
you got. When the Bereans said they searched the scriptures daily to prove it is so, what scripture did they search for? What did they have it there?
I'm actually going to be getting into that.
Okay. Well, that was a big question.
Okay.
It's what they were using.
Okay.
I think maybe this book, and I don't think they spoke of that Septuagint came out.
What did you say?
I may have misspoken while I said regarding your question. I just wanted to let you know that.
Okay.
And I'm sorry for not listening to you when you were answering the first question.
That's okay.
I'll remember to listen to you next time, or at least hear you out before I make considerations on that.
Oh, that's a good one. Hey,
Hi.
I remember you.
I remember you also.
Yeah, because we talked. What's your wife?
Your name is Wendy.
How'd you remember that?
My wife will be coming here.
Okay.
She had to do a lot of things to get wrapped up. We have a timeshare, and the timeshare we have begins this afternoon, and so we're going to be here for a whole week. And so my son from California is here with his whole family and his 3 children, and so they're all going to be coming in a little later today.
Okay.
And so they couldn't be here. I left separately earlier in order to do this.
Okay, because I thought, where's his wife? I looked
She will be here a little later.
Find her. Okay, great. I enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, all right.
No, not here, no.
Oh, no, I just said, no. I didn't ask you. Yeah. He was going to come visit our church. He was down here somewhere. So I think he goes to that one church is our Eastern Coast. That's John.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah. This is my new friend, Wendy. Oh, my God.
Bitter half, I mean better half.
Yes. She's the one that also filled out the
But you haven't been yourself lately, have you?
Can you tell me what time it is? That means we're supposed to start now.
Well, is he supposed to come back?
Well, he's got to come back and set it up for
Oh, yeah, did you just find out?
live streaming. So I got to wait, but at least I know that he should be here.
He's not got tied up for
A month or two. Then she looked at me, she tried to find out. She looked at me. Hello, I'm still over there, you know. Still love you no matter what. And she said, you haven't been yourself.
He's going to be here a little
Without
while.
realizing how funny that actually was.
He and his 3 girls and his wife and my wife are all going to be coming here shortly.
I lost the connection there of how recent it is for you. Because for me, I've had like, well, how many years have I had that? I probably, since 2009 to now. Yeah.
The fellow that was doing the recording, what's his name?
Anthony.
Yeah.
Hey, Brian, is Anthony out there? Do we need him to start it?
He needs to do the live streaming.
Brian's gonna look at it.
Yeah, he's still going.
You're still on. You're live.
I'm live?
Yeah.
It means, in other words, I can continue.
You can continue on.
All right, we're ready to continue. I was told the live streaming is still going. The next chapter is languages spoken in Palestine in the first century. Now, when I say Palestine, it refers to a combination of Judea, a little north of that was Samaria, and a little north of that was Galilee. So it's Palestine is that whole area. The languages spoken in Palestine in the first century. We need to discuss languages because in order to know what kind of a translation was needed in any particular place, we have to know what languages were spoken there. Ancient society was quite a bit different from what it is today. Today, if you want to know a language, you go over to a nearby university, and you sign up for a class, and you could learn a foreign language, even Greek. But that's not the way things were anciently. Anciently, they didn't have printing presses. You had to travel a long distance in order to learn. You had to pay your teacher because there was no public education. And it is estimated that less than 10% of the people in ancient society were literate. Less than 10% of people in ancient society were literate with their own language. Required somebody who was wealthy to learn another language. And the leisure time, people had to be involved with things you don't have to do today. Today we have dishwashers and washing machines and all these other things that save time. Back then, they had to gather their food from agriculture where it was growing. They didn't have the leisure in order to be able to study another language. So if things were so different, we can't imagine. Today, if a Jew wants to know Hebrew, he goes to a local synagogue and he takes a class in Hebrew. Anciently, they couldn't do that because it required a wealthy person, and you'd have to pay somebody a fee for his salary, her salary, in order to be able to learn ancient Hebrew. And it's very few people. Well, I'm going to read this paragraph. The foundation for the discussion of language of the Septuagint and the New Testament requires a knowledge of the languages spoken in Judea and Galilee by Jews. This topic has been a heated scholarly debate for many years. Finally, a book was published in 2015. In 2015, authored by Michael Wise, that should put this question to rest. A whole book devoted to the languages of ancient Palestine, and it's based upon actual letters that were involved with 400 people found in the caves of the Judean desert. Now, I could get too sidetracked, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, about how he knows it, but he did statistical studies based upon 400 people that were from over about a 100-year period. In terms of the quality of their signature and all sorts of other details and what they signed and what language it was written in, he wrote a whole book about that.
What's the name of the book?
The name of the book, it's in the bibliography, and it's available for a free download, and you can get that information. Michael Wise wrote the book in 2015, and he wrote, let's see, on page 331, virtually all Judeans spoke one dialect or another of Aramaic. In other words, Aramaic was the universal language in Judea and Galilee. Then on page 296, Wise presents circumstantial evidence that perhaps 2/3 of the Jews knew some Hebrew. This was in the first century. 2/3 of the Jews spoke Hebrew. Then on page 344, Wise indicates that there is insufficient data to arrive at a percentage of the population who spoke Greek. People who were employed by the Roman government had to know some Greek. Roman soldiers stationed in Judea spoke Greek. and there are some references, I have references to that, so that salespeople who sold goods to Roman soldiers had to know some Greek. Coastal cities that harbored Greek trading vessels needed people who spoke some Greek. Trading roads that ran through Palestine needed people who spoke some Greek. Why? In order to trade. There was a trade route that ran through southern Galilee. However, the people who knew sufficient Greek to meet these needs, that is, to engage in trade, did not necessarily have to have a large Greek vocabulary. So some Greek was spoken for practical needs, but it was not ubiquitous. Now there's a very interesting scripture in Acts chapter 6 and verse 1. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I want to talk about it for a moment. There's a Greek word that's translated in the King James Grecians. And what it actually means is Greek speaking. And it's talking about Greek speaking Jews that were gathered as first Christians. And it spoke about the needs of people who were Greeks, Greek speaking. And so it made a distinction between one group that's called Greek speaking Jews compared to others that were not Greek speaking Jews. And that itself makes it clear that there were many, many Jews who didn't speak Greek because they're the others. And study that Greek word, you'll see that there was a class of Jews that were believers in Christ. And that class of believers, they were Grecians, so to speak. Greek speaking is what it means. And others were not, and so there were many Jews that were not Greek speaking. I want to go on to the next chapter. The need for a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. There was a practical reason that the Septuagint translation was made. In the year 332 BCE, Alexander the Great victoriously entered Egypt as its master. He declared that a city should be built named after him. That city was named Alexandria. It became the second most populous city in the Roman Empire, estimated to have 500,000 people. And 40% of them were Jewish. 40% of them are estimated to have come from Judea, and maybe some from Galilee. That's a huge percentage. 200,000 Jews lived in Alexandria. It's an interesting phenomenon, just like today, outside of Israel, the greatest number of Jews are in New York City. Well, outside of ancient Israel, the greatest number of Jews were in Alexandria.
How many Jews were in Alexandria again?
Alexandria is the largest city of Egypt, anciently. It was very, very minuscule before Alexander the Great, but it became the second most populous city in the Roman Empire. Rome was the largest, and then Alexandria was the second largest city. And the third largest city was tied between two cities, Jerusalem and Antioch. And after the war from 66 to 70, Antioch became the third largest city because of how many people that died in Jerusalem.
Thank you.
Now, the transplanted Jews brought Aramaic and Hebrew idioms with them into Egypt, where the language of the educated class was Greek, although the native population spoke the Coptic language. Now, the Coptic language gradually dwindled in use because of the promotion of the Greek language by the Ptolemies. The general that established the city of Alexandria was Ptolemy, and his dynasty was in the Ptolemaic dynasty up to Cleopatra. And Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty when the Romans were victorious under Octavian and the Romans took over. I want to make a quote. In the villages of Egypt, it was more than simply the basics of Greek education that were taught. Those who went through this system had an important role to play in a Ptolemaic system of government. And whatever their original background, the culture that they learned was the conqueror's culture, unquote. In other words, instead of studying Egypt's history, they studied Greek history. They actually studied the various places where Alexander the Great conquered as he went along, and conquered even up to India. And all of that was taught to the children in Egypt because the Greeks imposed it upon them. Here's another quote. If this ancient Egyptian school book, they found an ancient Egyptian school book, was the way in which Greek-speaking children were educated in Ptolemaic Egypt, we must conclude that their schools were fiercely Hellenocentric and quite deliberately ignored the Egyptian cultural tradition which surrounded them. These schools were exclusive. They evidently did not cater for Egyptian children, nor indeed for any other non-Greek children, since knowledge of the Greek language was taken for granted. They had no program for teaching Greek as a foreign language, unquote. In other words, they found a textbook for children in ancient Egypt, and it presumed that the children already knew Greek. And it's taken for granted by scholars that the culture and the language was taken over because of the Greek influence of the Ptolemies and the government. Now, it's an interesting phenomenon that Greek teachers in Egypt did not have to pay the tax, and their families did not have to pay the tax, because they were exempted because they taught Greek. And so there were incentives for learning Greek, and there were incentives for teaching Greek. And so the Greek influence under the Ptolemies was very vast, and over time the Coptic language began to die out in favor of the Greek. And the same phenomenon occurred among the Jews. The Jews were part of that culture, and they also learned Greek when they went from Judea. In Alexandria, about 40% of the population was Jewish, and these Jews brought Aramaic and Hebrew idioms with them into the Greek language of Alexandria. To be sure, the most noteworthy scholars that centered around the big library, they had a higher class Greek. But the ones away from that library and museum, they spoke the everyday language. And the everyday language became infused with Hebrew and Aramaic idioms. And the reason that they were infused with Hebrew and Aramaic idioms is because of the 40% of the population of Alexandria that was Jewish that brought the Hebrew idioms and the Aramaic idioms with them from Judea when they went to Judea. They went from Judea into Egypt. And so, and they have actually found all over ancient Egypt, all over ancient Egypt, they have found inscriptions that have Semitic and idioms and Aramaic idioms, even if they had no knowledge at all that there were any Jews over there. And they also found potsherds, which is pieces of broken pottery that had writing on them in Greek. And the potsherds from Egypt, anciently, regardless of what part of Egypt, they had Aramaic idioms and Hebrew idioms. So we know that the Greek language spoken in Egypt was permeated, filled with Aramaic idioms and Hebrew idioms. And so when the translation of the Septuagint was made from the Hebrew into the Greek, it had all those idioms. It had all those idioms. And it's a strange phenomenon because it's a little different from the way it was in ancient Greek-speaking cities. In the Greek city-states, they didn't speak that way, the way they spoke in Egypt, Greek. I'm talking about the common people, not where the major library or the museum was. And so that's an interesting phenomenon of language. I want to go to the next chapter now. I thought to mention this. This is a very interesting thing. Way back in 1979, I saw that a certain organization, a Sabbath keeping organization, had a booklet that they were sending out for free, and the booklet was titled Exploding the Greek New Testament Myth. Exploding the Greek New Testament Myth. And when I read that booklet from beginning to end, there was not a single reference. Not a single reference. And the whole reason why that booklet was written, in my opinion, was in order to promote sacred names. In other words, because the Greek New Testament didn't have sacred names, they had to have a theory to substantiate their belief that the apostles were using sacred names. And so they made up this theory that the New Testament was written in Aramaic in the 1st century and was later translated into Greek. And I really had to scratch my head. Is this really so? And so I had to do a lot of study about ancient languages and where they were. And so I'm going to talk about now the Jews in Asia Minor spoke Greek, not Aramaic, and not Hebrew. And that's the title of this next chapter. How do we know that? Here's a quote from a scholarly source. It's in the bibliography. Quote, rather than monolithic, the Roman Empire became bilingual. In the East, Greek remained the common language of the educated, and Latin, understandably, served as an administrative function. This is for the Roman government. Toward the West, Greek entered the language of mostly lower-class immigrants, but also gained status among educated society, which acquainted itself with the glories of Hellenic centuries past and present, unquote. And the Hellenic glories had to do with the Greek tragedies, Greek poetry, and other Greek writings that were handed down. And the Roman nobles in Rome, they studied those Greek writings. And so Greek was actually promoted by the Roman nobles. And they didn't try to force Latin on the rest of the population. They were very content with Greek, and they let Greek promulgate itself. And so the Roman government promoted bilingualism, Latin and Greek, and the Greek soldiers spoke Greek. The Roman soldiers spoke Greek, what I mean, in the 1st century. They spoke Greek. Excavations of writings from Asia Minor, where the Apostle Paul preached the gospel, show that the only Aramaic writings that were dug up provide distinctive features of Aramaic that identify the time of the Persian dominance of the region prior to Alexander the Great. And I have a reference for that. In other words, they have found writings of Aramaic in Asia Minor. But when you look at the detail of how it was written, it's all from the Persian period, before Alexander the Great. There's not a single writing that has come down to us from archaeological excavations of Aramaic after the time of Alexander the Great. Furthermore, some synagogues have been looked at excavation-wise in Asia Minor. And the synagogues have shown surviving writings in Greek, none in Aramaic and none in Hebrew. Oh, you do find the Hebrew word shalom as an isolated word, which people know means hello, goodbye, and wonderful, so to speak. Shalom. And so that one word shalom was a little amulet of a single Hebrew word that was found in the ancient synagogues of Asia Minor. But except for that, it's all in Greek that were found. There's no Hebrew and there's no Aramaic. Let's see where I was up here in my notes. I'm going to quote from another source. Perhaps not all, but the most important indicators of Jewish cultural resilience, and resilience means flexibility, can be found in Syria, that's to the east of Asia Minor. And to the east of Asia Minor, Aramaic was spoken. Even more marked than in Asia Minor. Jerusalem and the necropolis of Beth Sherim are not as important for Jews of Asia Minor. There, in Asia Minor, is almost no bilingualism, and certainly no retention of Aramaic in Asia Minor. That's what he wrote, no bilingualism in Asia Minor. Now, in the rest of the Roman Empire, there were native languages in different locales that they spoke before Greek entered. But they gave way in all of the big cities to Greek. But in Asia Minor specifically, even the native languages died out. And Greek was universally there in Asia Minor, according to the scholar. We must conclude that in order for the gospel to be successful in Asia Minor, it must be brought to the synagogues of Asia Minor in the Greek language. Some form of the Septuagint would have been popular among Jews in Asia Minor in the 1st century. Why? That's before the three, before Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion translated from Greek to Hebrew. The only thing they had was the Septuagint. And so in Asia Minor, they had some form of the Septuagint, but we don't know exactly what it looked like, because none of the Septuagint survives that was used in Asia Minor in the 1st century. We don't have any of the Septuagint from the 1st century the way it was used in Asia Minor. Now I want to go to the next chapter, the nature of the Greek language in the Septuagint and the New Testament. Many papyrus as well as broken pottery remains from ancient Egypt with Greek writing prove beyond a doubt that the general population of ancient Alexandria had adopted the Aramaic and Hebrew idioms into their common spoken language. And this was incorporated into the Septuagint. So the Septuagint reeks all over the place with the Aramaic and Hebrew idioms in the Greek. And it's because it was the common language of the Jews and the general population in Alexandria where the Pentateuch was first translated. I want to quote from another source now. As Conybeare and Stock and others noted nearly a century ago, Septuagintal Greek is often, quote, hardly Greek at all, but rather Hebrew in disguise, especially in its syntax. In other words, the Septuagint not only looks like the Hebrew, except for the fact that it's written in Greek instead of Hebrew, but its phraseology and its idioms and all that look like it came from Hebrew. And even the syntax is not ordinary Greek syntax. The syntax of it is like the Hebrew. Very interesting. There were many Jews from Alexandria that participated in producing the Septuagint translation, with some translated literally and others freely. Certain Hebrew words were translated into different Greek words. Thus, the method of translation of the translators was not uniform, and the vocabulary was not uniform. Now, there are specific theological terms that were kept uniform, but non-theological terms had a lot of flexibility in how they were translated, and the translators were not conforming to the same method of translation. Some were very literal, some were not literal. The Greek plays and other literary classics from Athens were written in a polished Greek form called Attic Greek or Classical Greek. And on that basis, I want to quote from another place, quote, indeed, many words and expressions attested in the Greek Bible are simply absent from the classical body, while other words are used with a new meaning, unquote. In other words, the Septuagint Greek had a lot of differences from the kind of Greek spoken in the city of Athens and in other Greek city-states. Adolf Deisman, in about 1900, participated in archaeological excavations in the Mediterranean East and examined Greek writings from the era of the 1st century. And he wrote, Justin wrote about him, quote, Deisman was able to show that the linguistic basis, the morphology, basic vocabulary, and syntax of Septuagint and New Testament Greek is all the common non-literary language of the Hellenistic period as it was practiced throughout the Greek-speaking world at the time the writings were created. And he's speaking especially in Egypt, unquote.
Is common the same as koine?
Koine means common. That's what the word common means. Common, you could say koine, you could say that. But you see, what was common in one area was not necessarily common in another area. What was koine to the Greeks in Athens was not the koine in Egypt. The koine means common, and it depends on the locale as to what it implied. When discussing the Septuagint, it must be kept in mind that there were eventually writings that became part of the Septuagint that were never part of the Hebrew Bible. This included the Apocrypha and even the New Testament, because the copyists were eventually Christians rather than Jews. In other words, when you look at the 600 surviving handwritten copies that date from approximately 300 AD onwards, all of them were copied by Christians, none of them by Jews. And they were, according to scholars, they were rather sloppy in terms of how accurately they copied. I want to quote again from another source, quote, "The nature of the language of the New Testament has been discussed, debated, and variously explained from the early Christian centuries to the present day. It is obviously Greek, but it differs markedly from classical Greek on the one hand and from contemporary Koine Greek on the other, not only in the use of many words unknown to classical and Hellenistic authors, but especially in the use of many non-Greek forms and syntactical constructions," unquote. In other words, he's talking about the New Testament and the Septuagint. They have a lot in common in certain theological words and in syntax and in other features of the grammar that were different from the Greek spoken of elsewise in the Roman Empire. Contemporary Greek, far from Palestine and Egypt, did not have the Aramaic and Hebrew idioms, so this accounts for one major difference. There's a whole book published in 1976 that discusses the Greek writing style of each of the writers of the New Testament. Each author is different in writing style. In other words, you could look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and even though they're all using the basic, similar type of Greek, they differ markedly. In the Hebrew, for example, you have the word "and" occurring all over the place. There are thousands of "ands." That's a connector.
In John?
And this is in the Hebrew. And in in the book of Mark, it is more that way in the Greek equivalent to "and," which is we would spell with K-A-I. K-A-I is the Greek equivalent of "and it occurs all over the place in the book of Mark, and much, much less in any of the other three Gospels. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into details. I have some things more in my notes that I don't have time to cover. But the point is that each of the authors of Matthew and Mark and Luke and John can be distinguished by people who are scholars in the Greek language, and they see differences in all four authors. So they could never have been translated by one person from a supposed a hypothetical original language of Greek or Hebrew into Hebrew or Aramaic into Greek. Never could have been done because each one of those distinctive authors are different in terms of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. And Paul's writing is also different. I don't have time to do quotes on that. Now I want to go into one other chapter, and it has to do with the abandonment of the Septuagint. It was accepted by Jews until they saw the inaccuracies. And then they had their own three translations of Achilles, Symmachus, and Theodotion. But the Christian world kept up with the Septuagint, and they kept copying it. And so they accepted, the Christian world accepted it as inspired until Jerome. Until Jerome. Now, what happened with Jerome?
He lived in Palestine.
Jerome was born at the tip of the Aegean Sea, between Italy and the Greek peninsula. Just on that tip, called Stridon, a city called Stridon is where he was born. His father was wealthy, and his father noticed that Jerome had a very good grasp of languages. And he decided that he would send his son to Rome, the best place to learn foreign languages and Latin. And so Jerome's father sent him to Rome. And he excelled in languages. And he wrote some books in Latin, and it was a very fluent, smooth-flowing Latin, and it sold widely. And he began to see that he could earn a living by writing books in Latin, because people bought his books. They loved his Latin writing style. And he was a Christian. His father was a Christian, and he was a Christian. And the Bishop of Rome said to Jerome, "We need a new accurate translation into Latin of the Bible. I want you to do it. You have such a good writing style." And so Jerome knew that he had to spend his time writing a new translation into Latin. And he found a copy of the Septuagint in Rome. And so he started out with the book of Psalms. And he translated the book of Psalms from the Septuagint into Latin. Then he got the bright idea of visiting Origen's library long after Origen had died in Caesarea. So he went to Caesarea. And he found the hexapla. And he looked at the fifth column, the column of the Septuagint. And he looked at the Psalms. And he says, "Oh no! The Psalms and the hexapla is different from the Psalms that I used in Rome. They're supposed to be the Septuagint, but it's different." And so Jerome decided he needed to translate the Psalms all over again, using the fifth column of the hexapla. And so he made his second translation of the Psalms into Latin from the Septuagint that Origen had in the fifth column. And then after that, he began to study Origen's writings. And he began to read where Origen had found three major recensions of the Septuagint. And he says, uh-oh, this is not a good thing. And sometimes he realized that Origen wrote letters in which he said he couldn't even decide which was the best. And he had to heal the text. Uh-oh. And Jerome began looking at other copies of the Septuagint, and he said that the Psalms he found elsewhere didn't agree with this fifth column of the Septuagint that Origen had. And he says, "Oh, how am I going to fulfill the commission given to me by the Bishop of Rome to make an accurate translation when I don't even know what the Septuagint should have?" And he traveled over to the east, where Hebrew was spoken, and he began to study Hebrew. And what he did is he went back to Caesarea and he looked at the Hebrew text found in the left column, the first column of the hexapla. And he compared it to the Hebrew text found in the synagogues. And he said, it's exactly the same. It's letter for letter. The Hebrew text on the left column of the hexapla is exactly the same as every synagogue I go to. Whether I go to the synagogue in Bethlehem or any other Jewish city, there's no difference in the text of the Hebrew. They copy exactly the same. That's the key to making an accurate translation into Latin. I have to go back to the Hebrew. And he kept it a secret unto himself until the year 391. And that's when he decided to explode the Septuagint. Even though he knew that the Christian world thought it was inspired, even though their texts of the Septuagint differed from one another. And so Jerome, in the year 391, began, and he may have completed it in 391. People don't know if he completed it in 391 or 392. But he wrote this book in which he wrote about the Septuagint. And he quoted certain passages of the Septuagint and how they were translated in Aquila and Theodotion and Symmachus. And he compared them. And he said, look, these are made directly from the Hebrew. And the Hebrew is the same everywhere I go, unlike the Septuagint. And he explained from Origen's writings how Origen was unsure, though he was afraid to throw bombshells against the Septuagint. He was polite. But you could see from his writings that he didn't know what the correct text of the Septuagint was. And he explained why the Septuagint should be abandoned. And he wrote the copies of his book, published in either 391 or 392, to several leaders of the Christian church when he completed it, explaining why he needed to go back to the Hebrew and make an accurate translation into Latin. Because you can't trust the Septuagint, he found. And so it started a rumble in the Christian world. There were debates going on between Augustine and Jerome. And scholars who look at the letters where they exchanged their writings about the Septuagint, they say, whoa, Augustine, bishop, tried to rebut Jerome, but he failed miserably because his logic and reasoning were so poor compared to what Jerome had said in his book. And finally, it took years and years, but people had to recognize Jerome was correct. There were so many differences among the Septuagint, you couldn't tell which was right and which was wrong. They can't all be inspired. And also, Jerome pointed out that the chronology in the Septuagint could not be right, because according to that chronology, simple arithmetic, based upon the chronology in the Septuagint, could prove that Methuselah would have had to live till after the flood. And yet the Septuagint itself says that only 8 people survived the flood. Noah, his 3 sons, and their wives, 8 people. And so the Septuagint itself indicated only 8 people survived the flood, but the chronology of the Septuagint made Methuselah live till after the flood. And in one of his letters, Augustine admitted to Jerome, yes, Methuselah did not live until after the flood. And so he had to throw in the towel. And he had to recognize there were problems with the Septuagint. He was trying to defend it, but he couldn't. And so the rejection of the Septuagint by the Christian church was brought about by the pioneer and scholar Jerome, who mastered Latin and Greek and Hebrew. Now, the very last chapter, and I need to wind down because I know I'm running out of time over here. I just want to mention one interesting thing, and there are so many things of interest that could be discussed in terms of differences between the Masoretic text and the Hebrew. But I want to mention one particular thing, and it has to do with the wording that's used 6 times in the Hebrew, the month of Aviv, the month of Abib, the month of Aviv. Now the question is, how did the Septuagint translate the month of Aviv? How does a New English translation of the Septuagint translate the month of Aviv? It's an interesting thing. It translates it, when you translate from into here, into what does it say in here? It says in all 6 places where the month of Aviv is mentioned in the Hebrew, it says the month of the new. The month of the new what? It doesn't say in the Greek. They don't know what was supposed to be new. And they just say the month of the new. Now the translation here says the month of the new things. It adds the word things. Because it's got to have some noun that it's new. And so he doesn't know what it is, and it doesn't say in the Septuagint, so it just says month of the new things. Now, there are two particular scriptures in which the word aviv in the Hebrew, is used a little differently. One of those is the hail plague in Exodus chapter 9, verse 31. Now, for the hail plague in Exodus 9:31, the word aviv is translated in the New English translation of the Septuagint. It's translated ripe. Ripe. And the same Greek word is used in Brenton's translation, but he doesn't know what the Greek word means. He translates it differently. I'm not going to spend any time on that. But I do quote a source that showed that ripe is a good translation of the Greek word that's used in Exodus 9:31. Now the question, that I want to bring up is, could ripe be its meaning?
Is it Canaan?
No, it's not. I'm kidding. Anyway, I want to go into the question, could the Septuagint translation of the word for aviv mean really ripe in the Hebrew? And I'm going to explain why it can't. In the year, a paper was published in the year 1883, by W. Robertson Smith, who was a Greek scholar who wrote a big treatise on the Greek grammar of the New Testament. And what W. Robertson Smith did is he wrote to agricultural stations along the Nile River, before the Aswan Dam was built, before the natural overflow of the Nile River was changed, when the Aswan Dam was built later. And he wanted to find out from these agricultural stations the time of the ripening of barley and their location along the Nile River. And they wrote back to him. And from the northern part to the southern part, it had a 5-week variation. 5-week variation because it was warmer in the southern part of Egypt than it was in the northern part of Egypt. And with various gradations in between the warmest part and the coldest part, from southern Egypt to northern Egypt, the barley ripened differently over a 5-week stretch, so that the ripening began in southern Egypt 5 weeks earlier than in northern Egypt. Now, if the barley was really ripe in the northern part of Egypt, then it would have been 5 weeks riper in southern Egypt, and then it already would have been harvested in southern Egypt. But the hail plague describes, if you read it carefully, that the barley was destroyed throughout Egypt. It was destroyed both in the southern part and the northern part. So if it was ripe in the north, it couldn't have been ripe in the south. It would have already been harvested 5 weeks earlier. So the word aviv simply means came to a head, eared, was in the ear. Was in the ear is what it means. Ear is what the word aviv means. Headed, eared is what the word aviv means. And it does not specify any particular stage of ripening. At the time of the hail plague, the whole 5-week stretch, was called aviv. Barley was ruined for all of Egypt, the whole 5-week stretch. And so the ripe is not a good translation. And it shows that the translators of the Septuagint did not know the meaning of aviv. Not only because they translated it ripe when it couldn't have been ripe all over Egypt, but also because they translated it month of new. And they didn't even know what was new. And there's also another place that the word aviv occurs, and that's in Leviticus chapter 2, verse 14. And the translation there is also the Greek word for new, without the Septuagint specifying what was new. even in Leviticus chapter 2, verse 14, where it occurs. Now, what all of this shows is that the Septuagint translators did not know certain words in terms of what it should be translated as. So that is trying to give an overview of the Septuagint. Somebody tell me what time it is.
Keep going.
3:48.
3:48? Okay, I have actually taken up the 45 minutes. If this keeps going, and I'll let it keep going, I don't know until when, but if anyone has any questions, this is the time to ask questions because I've used up the time. Yes?
Okay, I'll stand up so you can hear my big accent. There was something that you mentioned during when you did the background, when you were talking about languages in Palestine. I don't think it's critical to what you're saying about the Septuagint, but I do think it's critical. It's something that could affect our confidence in, especially the New Testament, with the Scriptures. Which, and I think you're probably right that 90% of a lot of scholars, especially archaeologists, I know this is to be true of, that 90% of them would be secular and not really believers in the authority of Scripture, okay? And so, if we take that for granted, that a lot of the linguists, a lot of the archaeologists are not believers, and they're skeptics about the biblical truth that we understand, then the statement was that 90% of the people in Palestine would have been illiterate, basically.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
I think there's a lot of evidence that would contradict that. I don't believe it for several reasons. And so there are, first of all, the writing materials deteriorated. So but we do have some things that have survived, like a Tel Zaid abecedary, which is this was actually a teaching tool. It's an alphabet that would have been used to teach maybe even school children. It is in a far-flung small town. So that tells us that people were being taught to write in small towns in Judea. And also, there's the Kayafa Astrakhan. And these things date to around the year 1000 BC. So they're very early. They were in either Hebrew or Proto-Canaanite, whatever script they debate about that, but they're very early. And it shows that the Hebrew, in these, the Ashkelon is just written in ink on potsherds, probably had something to do with, or a stone fragment, in other words. And it probably had something to do with trade, or it showed that common people were using the Hebrew language. And so, and then there was also the Gezer, was an agricultural calendar. And so, but the main thing that I would put out as for thought is that in Deuteronomy 6,
I know that in Deuteronomy 6, we're supposed to be teaching the children, but it doesn't say to write.
Right.
It doesn't say to write.
Right.
But I want to mention one thing about what you're saying, is that I have not found any ancient scholars about the literacy in the Roman Empire that back up what you're saying. In other words, yes, there are ancient writings in Hebrew. I agree with you, and the priesthood was primarily responsible for teaching the people, and the priesthood was primarily responsible for learning Hebrew. However, that's not arriving at a percentage of the people.
They arrive at percentages, but the scholars do debate how Ralston and other scholars debate how the Hebrews were being educated at the time. Would they have been taught in the synagogue, or were they taught at home? Did they have any formal instruction? And there's a big debate about that. So it is not, I mean, when they throw that 90% of them being illiterate out there, I don't believe it, because Deuteronomy puts emphasis on writing. And I believe that the Hebrews were taught to write. I think they were always literate people. I think they were taught in the home, if nothing else. And then they may have had more formal instruction in the synagogue. I think the Levites made sure that they were literate people. Okay? That's just my belief.
Okay, you're welcome. I just want to say that my debate is not with you, And you know, it's the scholars that I have read that discuss literacy, and they say what I have repeated.
Yes, it's
So
true.
your debate is with them.
Oh, I know that, and
And I would like to get a source that you have so that I can read it myself.
it's exciting field because right now, that whole field of study is exploding. And so that's why it's really, and to me, it's very exciting just to read about it.
Well, I myself have read literacy works over the last 20 years. I have about a dozen works that I have made photocopies of that agree with what I've said.
Oh, yeah.
And so if you have something otherwise, I would be happy to look at it.
Okay, I have a pretty big collection. I'll email you some stuff.
Yes.
The lack of scholars wanting early Israelites or early people of any kind to be able to read and write is based on evolutionary belief. They think that ancient man was not educated, and that's probably the reason a lot of people say Israelites couldn't read and write in the past, but they could.
Unless you believe in evolution of man evolved.
Well, obviously, I don't believe in the evolution of man, what you're saying, but I believe that educated people were able to read and write Hebrew anciently. However, what I'm saying is that less than 10% of the people were educated enough to be able to do that. That's what I'm saying. Yes, the priesthood class were responsible. You can find scriptures in the Pentateuch and elsewhere that the people who were responsible for teaching were the priesthood. And when they got up and they preached before the people and they taught the people learned from the priesthood. And they were not necessarily responsible to read and write. And their adults memorized a lot of things, and when they heard the people preach on the Sabbath, they memorized what they heard, and they repeated what they heard to their children. It doesn't necessarily mean that they knew how to write.
So the priests that were sent from Jerusalem down to Alexandria to write the Pentateuch, they didn't know what a deed meant then.
What I'm saying is, no. The priests didn't go to Alexandria to do the translation. That is a myth. That's in the letter of Aristeas. That's a myth. The people that translated knew Greek better than they knew Hebrew. And according to what I have read. And it was translated by Jews who lived in Alexandria, not priests who came down from Judea.
Okay, so you verified that is a false letter then?
Yes. Yes. And then I have given references to explain why it's false. Any other questions?
I have one.
Yes.
Very good points, like 3 different translations of Septuagint at 3 different times.
There's actually 4 English translations of the Septuagint today. There's the Brenton translation, which is the most popular, and then there's the one that I have up at the front, the New English translation of the Septuagint. Those are 2 out of the 4. The reason I didn't mention the other 2 is because, number 1, they're not as popular, but number 2 is because it's not literal. The New English translation of the Septuagint is very literal. And it's more accurate in terms of the critical text. And I didn't mention the other 2.
I see. I used Raphael's Greek text of Septuagint. I have one question. Maybe it's a side question. Do you think Jesus or apostles or New Testament writers ever quoted from Septuagint?
Okay, now that's a very good question. As a matter of fact, I skipped over the chapter that discusses that. This is a very, very important question that I want to address. It's the quotations from the Old Testament into the New. Very, very important question. Thank you very much for raising that question. I overlooked discussing it.
Something that
First of all, there's a certain quotation that I have in here, is there's not a single text of the Septuagint that dates from the 1st century. There's not a single text of the New Testament that dates from the 1st century that survives. And so when we look at the quotations from the Old Testament and the New, since we do not have a Septuagint from the 1st century, and there are variations in the Septuagint that we have surviving, when we look at it, it's hard to know whether the quotation is simply the writer's recollection of what the scripture was, or whether it comes from the Septuagint, or whether it comes from the Hebrew. But scholars do indicate that about 75% of the quotations are closer to the Septuagint than they are to the Hebrew. About 75% are closer to the Septuagint than the Hebrew. Now, the other remark that I need to make in terms of some things I did go through is that outside of Palestine, the common language of all the Jews was Greek. It was not Hebrew and it was not Aramaic. And so they needed to have a translation in the Greek language. And that's what caused the Septuagint to get spread throughout all the Greek-speaking world of the Jews in the Roman Empire. And so the Septuagint was used there, even with all of its mistakes and whatever was in there. And so the question that people would then bring up, and I should have, it's in my notes here, but I just somehow or other skipped over the page. But an important question is how to explain why some of the quotations from the Old Testament and the New are not exactly like the Hebrew. Some of them are more like the Septuagint that differs from the Hebrew in some of these places. Well, the answer is that, first of all, the Jews, for lack of ability to have a translation that was closer to the Hebrew during the first century, they had an imperfect translation of some version of the Septuagint. And when the gospel writers wrote to those churches, when Paul wrote, for example, to those churches, he knew that they were using a version of the Septuagint. And he didn't have any power to change that. He was not going to write a whole new copy of the Greek from the Hebrew and try to make that the common text in the Greek-speaking world. He didn't have the power to do that. He didn't have the wherewithal, the money to go and have a new translation made that was more accurate. And so when he wrote those letters, he didn't have a choice. He had to write what he knew that the Jews were using, that they could look at, the educated ones, with their own eyes in terms of the Bible. And so he had to use a translation that they would not argue with him about, that they had in front of their own eyes. And so he used an imperfect translation knowingly. And I have quoted a source in here that scholars who write about these differences simply say that the main point, when you look at the main point, the writers, whether it's Paul or some of the others, when they use the quotation from the Old Testament and the New, the point that they were trying to make was not violated even when they used the Septuagint, even if it was not perfectly accurate from the Hebrew. The main point that they were trying to get across was still valid, even with an imperfect translation. But the reason why the writers of the New Testament had to conform a lot more to the Septuagint than the Hebrew is because that is what the Jews had, and they did not have a choice. It was not their commission. Their commission was to preach the gospel. It was not to go out and make a new, more accurate edition of the Greek.
So then none of them have access to Hebrew manuscripts? Hebrew?
They didn't know Hebrew.
Apostle Paul.
The Apostle Paul, when he was in Jerusalem, he had access to it. Yes, he had access to the Hebrew, and he absolutely knew Hebrew. Paul did. But he knew that the people that he was writing to, he knew that those people did not have the Hebrew and did not have the ability to check up on what he could put in more accurately than what they could see with their own eyeballs.
So he would have been fully bilingual, but the people he was writing.
Right, people writing to were not bilingual. And so he wanted to conform to what they would be able to see with their own eyes and their own Bible, which was some version of the Septuagint that we don't have.
Not only that, if the Bereans are checking up on what Paul's teaching them, they're only going to have likely access to a Greek-speaking Bible, right?
That's right, because they were in Berea.
Yeah.
And Berea was a Greek-speaking area. And so they had the scriptures that they could check up on, for which the basic theology of Paul was used, was the Greek. And I have to admit that when it says in John chapter 4, salvation is of the Jews, a person could achieve salvation through the Septuagint. It wouldn't destroy their salvation. Even if they don't keep Pentecost on the right day, that itself, I mean, people who know history of Sabbath-keeping groups, some of them were keeping Pentecost on a Monday instead of a Sunday. And it didn't destroy their salvation. So I'm not trying to say salvation is based upon knowing, the right way to do everything in terms of, the holy days and so forth. What I am saying is that the writers of the New Testament knew what scriptures their audience had. And they knew that they would get arguments if they didn't agree with their audience could see with their own eyeballs. And that's why the Bereans probably had some version of the Septuagint. We don't know what version they had because it doesn't survive from the first century.
There's enough, go ahead.
I think he's had a question all along.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, Alex
Yeah.
has a question.
This guy right here.
Oh, you have a question.
You
You're
have a
right in front of us.
I don't wanna be, I have some questions I may share privately, because I'm not sure if I wanna share that in open, but one question I do wanna share. So basically what you're pointing out is Paul, so if you're correct that the Greek Septuagint is false according to what Jerome has stated out, which I would like if you could send me a text about Jerome, I'd like to know more about that.
I have several references on Jerome in the bibliography, and it's available for a free download. My son told me that he would put it up on a certain website. The website is called hroots.org. Well, it's not Hebrew, it's H, the letter H, R-O-O-T-S, hroots.org is where my son is putting this document up on the website.
Okay.
And whether it's already up there or whether it'll be up there in another day, it'll be available for a free download.
All right.
And the bibliography has a lot of information on Jerome in it.
I'd like to look into more of that, because I didn't know much about the biblical theology, and I'd like to do my own study on this someday and take what you say about it and just bring, hopefully, I need to be persistent on, look at before God, and
Sure.
I may end up doing fast, perhaps, I don't know, I'm just,
Yeah.
this is a serious thing, it does, this Greek Septuagint does play a big part in one in Israel, it's something I do regard to though, but I don't follow everything he teaches though, but it was certainly a fascinating subject, Brian. I used to be very into the linguistic controversies though. I'm not into as much as I used to though, and I do think they're in an important place, and I do like to know more about it now and then when I get the opportunity to. So I thank you for sharing this.
Let me step in. There's a significant corollary that some may have missed in what Herb has brought out. If the Greek-speaking churches in Asia Minor, Athens, and Macedonia would not have been familiar with Hebrew idiom-infused Greek, I submit to you that the New Testament writers who are writing their Gospels and their epistles for those Greek-speaking churches that Paul founded, they're not going to throw in any kind of confusing Aramaic or Greek, Hebrew idiom into that Greek, which would throw a curve into their understanding of what's being said. They're going to use only, if they use any idioms at all, they're going to be already understood by that Greek-speaking church. And that has significant application in phrases like neoton, sabaton, which have been translated first day of the week. I submit to you there's no Greek literature that uses the word sabaton to apply to Sunday. And we could speak of other idioms too that might be relevant. Do you have no comment on that?
We can get bogged down in details about that. That has to do with County Pentecost, that phrase, and I don't want to get too bogged down in that. You have a question?
Yeah, I had a question. In Matthew 4, when Satan is tempting Jesus, and he makes a comment to him, don't you know how that it was written that you should worship, your God only? Whose version was Jesus referring to with Satan?
The quote is enough like one of the verses that's in the Old Testament that it's not a real distortion. And it's close enough to a certain verse in the Pentateuch. It really is not hardly any difference.
There's not a difference between the Septuagint or the Masoretic.
In the Masoretic text, it's close enough to that quote that you could say that.
Are there other quotes that Jesus refers to that's not?
They're close enough. There's a certain amount when you're trying to paraphrase by memory in a certain sense.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be necessarily 100% word for word exactly identical. And what we have is in the Greek anyway in the New Testament. It's not in the Hebrew. So we can't expect it to look 100% identical to what's in the Hebrew. But it's very close to it anyway.
I think she has a question here.
Yes.
No, I got an answer, it's fine.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Any other questions?